Welcome, everyone, to the Center for Global Justice. I'm Liz Mestris. I'll be your moderator today. I'm standing in for Lulu Guerrero, who's not able to be here today. The Center for Global Justice is a research center based in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico. We're committed to research and learning for a better world and advancing a solidarity economy. This year is our 20th anniversary. Since 2004, the center has been organizing a variety of educational programs such as this one, along with a number of international conferences and a program of international travel that includes regular trips to Cuba and also trips to Chiapas and other parts of Mexico. At this moment, we're planning our next trips to Cuba, which will take place next January, from January 26th to February 4th. You can get further information and register for the trip on our website. We're at www.globaljusticecenter.org. And throughout these years, we have relied on donations from people like you for our financial survival. So if you're joining us online, we encourage you to make a donation through our website. Again, that's www.globaljusticecenter.org. For today's program, we are delighted to have Vijay Prashad, who's with us virtually today from Chile, I understand. So Vijay will be discussing one of the key issues of our time, the contradictions of global migration. Vijay is the executive director of the Triconal Institute for Social Research. He's a very prolific speaker and writer, and the author of 40 books, including The Darker Nations, A People's History of the Third World, Washington Bullets, and The Withdrawal of Iran, Libya, Afghanistan, and the Fragility of U.S. Power, written with Noam Chomsky. He's taught at Trinity College in the U.S. At the American University in Beirut, at Renmin University in China. He's the chief editor of Leftward Books and a correspondent for Globetrotter Media and a columnist for Frontline. So very much welcome, Vijay. The floor is yours. Please.
Thanks a lot. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you
Okay,
fine.
Great. Well, I'm really happy to be with you. This is, I think, my second time with you. And it pleases me greatly, and I hope I can come and visit the center at some point in Mexico. I thought today I'd start with Venezuela to get into the discussion of the question of migration. Because, I was in Caracas on the 28th of July when there was the presidential election. It's interesting. A couple of days before the election, a CIA contractor by the name of Edison Research released a report saying that they had polling data to show that the opposition candidate, Edmundo Gonzalez, who had been stationed in the Venezuelan embassy in El Salvador and basically ran a torture program, he was the candidate of the far right. So the CIA contractor called Edison Research, based in New Jersey, said that in the poll, Edmundo Gonzalez was leading over Nicolas Maduro of the Socialist Party by about 30 points or so. So there was an election in Venezuela contested immediately by the opposition. They lost 52 to 44. Pretty close election all told, given the crisis that has been there in Venezuela since at least 2014. In 2014, the oil prices had tanked in the country. And also then the United States government began what, we are calling a hybrid war against Venezuela, sanctions on third parties, including ships to carry Venezuelan oil to other countries, the capture of Venezuelan gold by the Bank of England, the pressure that the US Treasury Department put on the International Monetary Fund not to release COVID funds to Venezuela, and so on. As a consequence of this major pressure campaign on the country, out of about 28 odd million people, 6 million Venezuelans left the country. Many of them, about 5 in 6, stayed in Latin America. For instance, in Chile, there's about 500,000 more Venezuelan migrants just in the period of a decade. A number of them went up the Darien Gap, which is between Panama and Colombia, into Mexico eventually, and then to the United States. 6.1 million people migrated in this very short period of time. Now, this is a microcosm of the global migration issue. Why did they migrate? I mean, effectively, these people could be called sanctions migrants. They migrated as a consequence of the sanctions policy of the United States government, illegal sanctions, unilateral sanctions placed against 70% of the poorer countries in the world. In fact, you don't need to take my word for it. Just about 10 days ago or so, maybe a week ago, the Washington Post ran a long article, an investigation into the sanctions policy, and laid out that the sanctions policy lays bare the cupboard in many countries to conduct redistributionist policies, welfare policies, and so on. Sanctions makes it impossible for countries to do normal business. Iran, for instance, very difficult to do normal business. So we might want to consider the 6.1 million Venezuelans sanctions migrants, a different category of migrants, among a slew of new categories of migrants. Why do I say new categories of migrants? Migration has been part of human history. There's nothing new about it. There should be nothing scandalous about it. Humans have migrated ever since we have any records of human existence. In fact, human existence might be synonymous with migration until a very recent period in our history that we became sedentary, and an even more recent period in our history when we decided to build borders and stop other people from entering certain lands. I mean, my family comes from a part of the Hindu Kush region, which is now between India, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. People in that region just sort of walked around. I mean, they all spoke the same language. They could go to Iran, where their language, Pashto, had elements of Dari in it, which has got a lot of Persian. They could come down into the Gangetic plain of India. Their language, Pashto, has drawn a lot from Urdu, which is similar to Hindustani, the language of the Gangetic plain. But even if they didn't have languages in common, they had forms of trade that they conducted with strangers. This is a normal practice in human history. In fact, it's very abnormal in human history to have nations and borders and so on. This is a very, very recent phenomena, maybe 200 years or maybe 300 at the most, that we began to police borders with such intensity. Okay, so I say new categories of migrants. Why? But because, after World War II, when the international treaties on migration were signed, the idea of migration effectively was framed under two main categories. One was refugee, and the other was asylum. Now, asylum seekers were people who were fleeing political persecution. And by the way, these categories of refugee and asylum are enormously shaped by the experience of World War II. That's how they enter international law in the post-World War II era. And they are enormously shaped by the Cold War. So when the first category, asylum, enters international migration law in the immediate period after World War II, it's actually shaped around the Cold War idea that people from the Soviet Union will flee and become asylum seekers in the West. So that's the category of asylum, shaped by the Cold War context. The second category of refugee comes from the experience of World War II, particularly when Jewish refugees had to flee the anti-Semitic attacks and then the Holocaust and go around the world, including to the Americas. They came as refugees, people seeking refuge, in other words, from genocidal attacks, political attacks, and so on. If you begin to see this, the two main governing categories of international migration law are about political persecution, political flight. Added to this later was religious persecution. If you faced religious persecution, that was also understood as a form of political persecution. And therefore, you could apply to be a refugee or an asylum seeker. These are the two principal categories after World War II. These are now standard categories, right? If a person is fleeing political persecution, they can apply for asylum. If they are fleeing, let's say, the devastation of their life world, they're being attacked as people, if they're fleeing for their existence as a people, they can apply for refugee status. The Rohingyas apply for refugee status. Edward Snowden applies for asylum in Russia against persecution by the United States government. These are the two old categories. And by old, they're not that old. They are shaped after World War II, after 1945, in the principal treaties around migration. Now, ever since the 1970s, new kinds of migrants have been detected in large enough numbers that they bear consideration. Again, it's important to recognize that migrants who migrate for economic reasons have been doing this forever. If your land becomes suddenly, unable to produce sufficient crops, you're going to pack your things up and move. Now, you can move as a settler, right? The wagon trains that went westward and displaced Native Americans in the Americas, they moved because they were seeking better land, better opportunities. In a sense, they were economic migrants. This is also an old history, but economic migration is not something that international migration law understood to be a protected category. So I can apply to migrate to another country. The other country has to frame its own rules, saying that, look, we need people who have advanced degrees. So only people with advanced degrees will be given papers, or we need people who speak a certain language, or we need people because we have a population problem. That's not something guaranteed by by international treaties. There is no international treaty that gives protection to an economic migrant. The only protected categories are refugee and asylum seeker. But I'm going to make the argument that there may be need to think of three different categories: economic refugees or IMF refugees, climate refugees, and sanctions refugees. I'm going to make an argument here for us that the only two protected categories of asylum seeker and refugee are anachronistic. We have three new kinds of refugees, not just migrants, refugees that need to be taken seriously. Okay, first, economic refugees or IMF refugees. I'm referring to the International Monetary Fund. It's very interesting. The International Organization of Migration started to track the immensity of migration in the 1990s by producing an annual report called the World Migration Review. They started doing this in the 2000s, as recently as the 2000s. Why? Because by the 1990s and into the early 2000s, 20 years ago, 20, 30 years ago, they detected that the number of people who are migrating for economic reasons from Asia, Africa, and Latin America had begun to grow astronomically. It's very important to know, by the way, that when I say that, let's not exaggerate it. 1 out of 30 people in the world is a migrant. 1 out of 30. 29 out of 30 people live in the country where they were born. But 1 out of 30 has shifted their country of origin. It's not like 50% of the world's population. It's not a small number because there are 7 billion of us. So it's about 218 million people, little more maybe, depending on how you count it. But it's not overwhelming. It's not like half the world's population. Sometimes when you hear politicians in Europe and the United States talk about migration, you'd imagine there were locusts banging at the gate, trying to get in and overrun the crops that have been so jealously protected in the United States or in Europe. I mean, the numbers of people, the raw numbers crossing the border into these countries is not that large, and in fact, populations haven't been growing astronomically. They've been growing geometrically. So, arithmetically, they've been growing. You can relax. I mean, it's not such a big problem. But what the IOM recognized is that from the 70s onward, new kind of migrant had started to appear, which was the International Monetary Fund migrant in their home countries. And you can track this quite easily. You can make a list of countries that are sending the largest number of migrants to Europe, for example. And then you can track what are the reasons why they are migrating. I've left out the most obvious reason, which is war. But you see, war refugees are covered by the original category of refugee. So I'm not adding it as a new category. If you are fleeing, let's say, the war in Afghanistan, you can apply for refugee status based on the conventional understanding of the international migration treaties. So it's not that there haven't been more war refugees. It's just that they can apply based on the normal categories that apply. But what about if a country is facing an economic war? If the International Monetary Fund shows up and says you can't fund education, you can't fund healthcare, that means a country like Jamaica, which trains on the public purse a large number of people, highly educated people, some of them become nurses. But since Jamaica cannot pay its nurses a decent salary, because the IMF has said you have to cut health spending, the nurses apply to go and work in the United States or in the UK. This creates its own form of brain drain. But as the nurses leave, quality of life begins to decline, the hospitals start to deteriorate because there's less government funding in these countries, which are anyway quite poor to begin with. Economic opportunities are limited and people start to migrate. These are International Monetary Fund refugees. So that's the first new category that I'm putting on the table. We should have something called the IMF refugee, number one. Number two, of course, we should be talking more about climate refugees. I mean, if you live in small island states where the coastlines have already disappeared, in fact, a number of islands in the South Pacific have actually gone under. That means the entire population has been displaced. These people often get on a boat and try to get to countries like Australia. The Australian government runs a concentration camp in countries offshore from Australia, a kind of Guantanamo of the South Pacific. So they don't have to allow people because they have a 1 foot on rule. If you put a foot on dry land, you can apply to enter the country. But they have to prevent them from coming to dry land. They catch them on sea, put them offshore. Many of these are climate refugees. As the climate crisis deepens, not just small island states going under, but as parts of the world just get too hot to live in and so on, people are going to start moving. This is a second category that we need to have international law take seriously. First, the International Monetary Fund refugee, and then the climate refugee. The third is where I started with in Venezuela, which is the sanctions refugee. if like 70, 80, 90 countries are under unilateral US sanctions, they cannot get credit in, the country begins to deteriorate rapidly. Some countries can buck sanctions, like Russia, for instance, large enough to prevent itself from collapsing when the US puts sanctions on it, or China can deal with sanctions, a very big country. But smaller countries have a difficult time. Zimbabwe struggled with sanctions, Syria struggling with sanctions, Cuba with the blockade, Venezuela struggling, Nicaragua struggling with sanctions, and then goes on and on. I mean, who hasn't been sanctioned? You'd be a very lucky country not to have been sanctioned. So there's a third category which is important, which is the sanctions refugees. We need to put that on the table. Can we think of the sanctions refugees? So that's the first part of my presentation, which is on the three new categories for refugees that I think need to be put on the table: the International Monetary Fund refugee, the climate refugee, and the sanctions refugee. Now, going to part two. In July, and I won't take very long so we can have questions. In July, the International Organization of Migration released its World Migration Report 2024, made for very interesting reading. One of the things that caught my eye was the status of remittances. You see, migrants are looked at as a kind of drag on society. If you listen to, let's say, Donald Trump, but it's not just Donald Trump. Biden goes, toe to toe with Trump on the anti-migration policy, or you listen to any European politician, you'll find they sort of treat migrants as a drag on the world. In fact, let me give you a statistic that has been the case since at least 9 years now. You see, when a migrant goes from the Philippines to work as a nurse, let's say in the United States or in the Gulf Arab countries, they end up staying 4 or 5 nurses in one apartment. They live like, college roommates, and then they remit or send back to their home country almost their entire salary. These remittances are actually now a fundamental part of the economics of the receiving country, because these remittances increase the consumption of the poorest parts of the population. See, unlike money that comes in as foreign direct investment, which comes in, let's say, to a big corporation, that money doesn't, it faces a kind of economic constipation. It gets stuck at the bank level, or it goes at most to produce some jobs and so on. But remittances goes directly into daily consumption. It allows a poor population in a poor country to actually survive, and it produces a thriving economy for ordinary people. Mexico is just like the Philippines in this. In countries like Mexico, in countries like the Philippines, Egypt, and so on, which are some of the top recipient or remittance earning societies, more capital, but now as kind of consumption, comes into these countries. More foreign exchange comes in through remittances than through foreign direct investment. Now, this is interesting. I mean, poor countries spend a lot of time and a lot of their dignity trying to attract foreign capital, foreign direct investment. If a banker shows up in Dhaka, for instance, the prime minister will go and greet them, treat them as important people, and so on. Meanwhile, when the migrant returns on a cut price airline, they are treated so badly in airports, so shabbily treated as criminals, one way or the other, both in their home country and in the country, even though the migrant, the person who is a remittance provider, is actually providing more economic growth in their country than that person who brings in FDI. This is a very important statistic. And the reason it's important is it should help us start to change the way we view migrants. Migrants aren't people who drag on society. In fact, as the IOM, or the International Organization of Migrants, says it, they drive development. They drive development. Now it is true that in an earlier period, there used to be very many more men migrating than women. The male-female split was extremely high. Over the past 20 years, the gender divide has actually increased a little bit. It has increased to about 52% male and 48% female. But as you can see, it's still near 50-50, even though there's been a widening. There are a lot of women migrants as well. But again, the picture of the economic or the IMF refugee or the sanctions refugee or the climate refugee, generally we think of men. There's a lot of women migrating. And let me tell you, the way at least 20% of people migrate by walking across countries, extremely dangerous for women and children. It's dangerous for men as well, but it's extremely dangerous. And there's very little attention at the top on this issue. So what I want to suggest is a couple of things, and then we can have a discussion. One is I want you to consider that, in fact, migration is both not a problem, that 1 out of 30 people are migrants. They're not hordes of people showing up anywhere, but it has been made into a problem by political leaders in some countries who see political advantage in pushing against migration. Secondly, there are at least 3 kinds of migrants, if not 4, whose migration is premised not upon their own decision making or even the decision making of their governments, but is premised on an imperialist policy. So, number 1 is the IMF refugee. This is not something that you can pin on the migrant. The migrant didn't choose to be an IMF refugee. Their country was ravaged by the International Monetary Fund. Secondly, climate refugee. Most of these countries produce carbon dioxide or any other kind of fossil fuel gases minimal level. This is mainly produced still in the advanced countries in Europe and North America. And number 3, the sanctions refugee. Countries don't sanction themselves. They are sanctioned by somebody else, largely the United States. I said 3, if not 4. The 4th, of course, just because it's an old category doesn't mean that war doesn't play a big role, plays a big role. Who's starting most of the wars in the world? It's the United States. I mean, sure, Russia invades Ukraine. That's one. Let's focus on that, forget everything else. But let's actually not focus on that and forget everything else. Let's look at all the wars of recent years: Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, the militarism in the central part of Africa and its Great Lakes region, the kind of hybrid wars in Latin America that have been constant attempts still in 2020s of doing coups in Honduras in 2019, Bolivia in Honduras in 2009, in Bolivia in 2019, 2020, when the coup regime was there, attempted coup in Bolivia this year, the attempt constantly to overthrow the Bolivarian government in Venezuela and so on. These wars also generate their refugees. That's the 4th. So the second point is that people, it's not their fault that they are migrating. They are forced to migrate by social policies that mostly emanate from Washington and its allied capitals. And the third point is that having migrated, migrants certainly produce much more value to their home countries than the foreign direct investment that the IMF asks these countries to get. That foreign direct investment comes with really bad conditions. It comes asking an enormous interest burden on these countries, whereas the remittances come in freehold. There is no need. You're not borrowing money from the migrants. You're basically getting the money free. That's incredible. I mean, if you think about it, these are heroes of their society. And in the countries where they come to work, they're also not taking jobs away from people. That's not an issue. Now, I do agree with people who say that, look, you can't ignore the needs of the working class in a country. Yes, I agree with that. But the working class in a country that perhaps is afflicted by migration, it maybe does hurt labor markets here and there. I know there's conflicting evidence on this. Even for the working class in the country, a nativist solution to migration doesn't get you anywhere. It just pits two workers against each other. It is true that the working class trade unions in the receiving countries should be fighting against IMF policies. They should be fighting against climate change. They should be fighting against sanctions. They should be fighting against war. Firstly, they should be fighting against those things because they're human beings. But secondly, they should be fighting against them, not against the migrants who are produced by them. Why are you fighting against the symptom of the problem? Fight the cause. Fight against the sanctions policy. If there was no sanctions and hybrid war against Venezuela, 6.1 million migrants wouldn't have left the country. They left the country not because Nicolas Maduro is this or that. They left the country because of the imperialist attack on Venezuela. So trade unions, rather than commit themselves to nativist policies, should actually take on an anti-war, IMF kind of orientation. It'll actually get the job done, what they want, which is not to have people come and compete for wages, if indeed that is the case. So I'm going to leave it here. I hope there's enough material for people to ask questions, not only about the migrant crisis by itself, because really there is no migrant crisis. There only is a crisis of capitalism. The migrants are a symptom of a much broader crisis. They are themselves not a crisis.
Thank you very much, Vijay. Do we have any questions? Oh, here in the back.
I'm wondering if you could comment on the relationship between the modern tendency towards free trade and migrants. Aren't migrants just part of a component, the labor component of free trade? And secondly, you touched on this, but I'd like to hear a little more. How do you achieve the reforms that you talked about, which I agree with? How do you achieve them when most of the, or a good number of the receiving countries are democracies and there's staunch opposition from labor interests in those countries?
Let's go to the second question first, the strategy issue. I mean, look, every country is going to have to deal with this differently. In many countries, the left has been put on a back foot because the left has adopted an open borders kind of policy, which doesn't address the anxieties that do exist in society, whether these anxieties are real or not real, whether they are founded in reality or not. There is an anxiety. So when people say, close the border, and your answer is no, open the border, it's actually just two people screaming at each other. You're not actually listening to the other person's opinion, whether it's founded or unfounded. So I think there's a lot of space to have a debate and discussion with the trade unions to take some leadership here, rather than commit themselves to a kind of rightward drift into anti-immigrant politics, to think about the immigrant as the symptom of a problem, which they can actually take a position on and which they had previously taken positions on. In fact, the US labor movement during NAFTA went all over the place on NAFTA. There were sections of the union movement, maybe United Electrical at the lead, which took a strong position against NAFTA, saying that, NAFTA is free, open borders for capital, closed borders for labor. And this is going to have the following catastrophic impact, which it ended up happening. And now what I don't understand is a union which was prescient, Why doesn't it return and campaign on that and say we were prescient? Why let it go and then go to the next fight? We on the left are unable to, to stand there and demand to be noticed for prescience, particularly when you have a mass base that could be, highly motivated and educated. If you can show that they, the union, they, the membership, took a very good position, which has now been proven correct. That yes, NAFTA does increase complementarities. Yes, NAFTA does improve certain trade barriers reduced. It increases the volume of trade and so on. But it has all these catastrophic impacts for labor on both sides of the border. On one side, you do have factory deserts in the United States. The whole practice of industrial production, it deteriorates. And on the other side, you get maquiladoras and other things. I mean, it could be important to bang on this, but they sort of surrender the terrain. I think it's important to engage the unions on this. They still have a mass base, and they did, many of them, take an excellent position in the debate around NAFTA, which mirrors the issue of IMF refugees and so on. That so many people in Mexico after 1994 fled the country because they couldn't grow corn any longer. The maize industry was very much damaged by NAFTA. That's a straightforward example. So that's one of them. I mean, in my opinion, free trade is a real misnomer because, what I would consider it to be is sort of managed trade. It's not really free trade. I mean, governments manage trade. Um, you know, they may reduce certain regulations, they increase others. There is a regulation, for instance, on intellectual property. Those regimes have in fact tightened, not loosened. There is no free trade in ideas. Part of the battle between the United States and China is over intellectual property, who is making high-tech advances and so on. So there's a kind of managed trade. Another question is managed in whose interest? If we give up the idea of free trade, which I think is a very bad phrase, free trade, it doesn't mean what it meant in the 19th century when people were advocating to break down illogical barriers, increase the socialization of labor, and so on. I mean, Marx, in some of his writings, is a kind of free trader because he promotes the socialization of labor, that will in fact create larger and larger areas of specialization, and that will advance us to socialism. But when they talk about free trade now, it's a misnomer. It just means I don't want the government to regulate X or Y. I want finance to be liberalized. No checks on the borders when I send money overseas and so on. So it's not a question of free trade, it's managed trade. And if you understand it as managed trade, then we can start thinking about managed migration. I mean, I'm not a big open border person because I don't know what that even means. You open the border between Pakistan and India. It's not possible. These two countries haven't even delimited the border. We are nowhere near the phase of open borders. Let's be more practical as a left and have intermediate demands and so on. We need to demand a better policy of managed migration. That there needs to be, in fact, an understanding of, as I said, a wider range of refugee categories. And these refugees, we should have a discussion and debate, who counts as an IMF refugee? Why? Maybe we categorize countries as the 10, 20 countries with the largest drop in standard of living after taking an IMF loan. People from that country are IMF refugees. I mean, there's a way to calibrate all this. But I would say, let's think about this as managed trade and managed migration, and not free trade and free migration. I get the slogan. If there's free trade, why not free migration? But in fact, there is no free trade. There's managed trade. And therefore, I think let's think about managed migration.
Well, By free trade, I simply meant or what's commonly meant is the reduction of tariffs. And isn't our migration rules, don't they operate like tariffs? They're just a barrier to the movement of an economic resource from one place to another.
I mean, technically that's true. That's exactly true. But the thing is, this is a class question, not a logical question. That somebody is managing capital or managing trade with a certain class perspective, and they are allowing certain things to be freely run by corporations and others not. And that's the nature of why I call it managed trade. I mean, for instance, most countries, against the wishes of corporations, sometimes with the wishes of other corporations, because remember, the states have to balance the interests of different sectors. Many countries, Chile, for instance, doesn't permit the entry of livestock and fruits and vegetables. They make a big deal at the airport if you show up with a mango. You know, it gets incinerated. That now is bad maybe for grocery stores, because grocery stores want to leverage arbitrage calculations about costs of fruit and get fruit from the cheapest supplier. But maybe this is bad for fruit growers. This is good for fruit growers in Chile, because it's effectively a tariff which prevents the import of certain fruits, and you've basically created an import substitution to develop or maybe enhance, get more capital inputs to improve your fruit production in Chile. But this is again managed trade, because it's being managed by the state, operating with a certain class sensibility to balance different sectors of the capitalist class, because it is also fragmented. That's the role the state plays, is it has to understand the totality of the picture, and it has to balance out which sectors of the capitalist class are more powerful, who has lobbied better, and so on. I mean, one of the reasons the migration issue is so confounding is that if you take California, big farmers in California actually want more migration. They would like to have seasonal migration. They want more people brought in through the H-4 visa so that they can bring people in for the summer to pick strawberries and then send them back to Mexico when the strawberry season ends. They want that. But other sectors of the economy don't want that. And so you have now competing capitals, and the state has to manage migration laws. So it's not even a question that there's no free migration. It's actually a class question. Who is dominating the state? Which fraction of the ruling class? Which sector of the economy? Because certain sectors would like, the country to be flooded with labor that is much more precarious than your domestic labor and is able to be used seasonally and so on. I mean, how many US born workers willing to work in the strawberry fields of California? I would hazard a guess and say very few. Even now with the tightening of the border, there are all kinds of exceptions for certain crops in Florida and certain crops in California. In Spain, very tight labor regime welcomes effectively what the Germans call Gastarbeiter, guest workers from Morocco to come and work their strawberry fields and so on. So this is why I say it's not a question of free trade. It's managed trade by the state. It's also managed migration based on class realities. I mean, what's the working class scenario for trade and migration? We need to work that out. We are criticizing the ruling class scenario on trade and migration. But what I'm saying is it's insufficient to just stand there with a flag that says, no free trade, but open borders. Just reversing the ruling class rhetoric is very wrong, because it firstly misunderstands the realities of trade and migration, and then it merely resorts to a negation of that rather than trying to go beyond it by absorbing what we have and then trying to lift it to a higher level of humanity. Can't hear.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you, but not the question.
Oh, no, I hasn't been a question yet. I was just asking.
Oh, sorry.
if Online had a question to raise their hand with the raise hand feature of Zoom. But anyone else here? Oh, he wants, okay, what?
Just think there's a class issue involved. Isn't that a whole nother discussion beyond the issue of migration, which, as you described, is causing a whole lot of human misery right now?
I'm only getting every second word. Sorry about that. Liz, could you repeat the question?
Yeah, let me try again.
Okay.
I agree, but the class issue you discuss isn't that a whole nother subject beyond migration? And as you described, our current situation with migration, whether you're talking about the United States or Europe, is causing a whole lot of human misery. It's tied to where the economic needs are for the migrants. And again, I like your ideas on how to remedy the migration.
I lost you at economic needs.
Okay,
Want me to try again?
okay,
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole lot of misery associated with migration, and it can be remedied by some of the suggestions you've made. How do we get there? Without going, like you say, to a whole examination of whether our capitalist system is the ideal form of human economic management.
Yeah, so I mean, firstly, the climate refugee debate and discussion has been taking place in the UN for the last decade. So this is not a difficult issue, this particular one, in terms of at least being at the table of discussion. Now, in Europe and the United States, there's great reticence to take this on, partly because these countries have been, or this zone has been eclipsed by a deep anti-immigrant kind of political current. But the rest of the world is willing to have this conversation. Sorry, I should add Australia to this. Australia also is unwilling to have the debate. I mean, part of the question is, you know, we have to also recognize that most migrants don't go to Europe, the United States, and Australia. You know, from the Syrian war, Lebanon, which has a population of 4 million people, absorbed 1 million Syrian refugees. That's, you know, incredible per capita number of refugees. Turkey absorbed an enormous number of refugees, you know, much greater than the per capita Germany or any of the countries where this has become an enormous political issue. Now, it's also true that these countries are not all behaving perfectly. Pakistan absorbed enormous number of Afghan refugees, is now saying, go home. You know, the war is over. Okay, the Taliban is back, but you got to go. You know, you don't have a permanent residency in Afghanistan. It created a bit of a political problem for Pakistan on the international stage because people criticize Pakistan. On the other hand, Pakistan had been burdened, and I use the word deliberately, by millions of Afghans who were coming in and out of the country. And they were, of course, bringing in problems in Peshawar, public services, and so on. These things shouldn't be ducked by the left. You know, again, I dismiss the open borders kind of attitude because I think it doesn't take seriously the material challenges faced in the global south. So most migrants are in the global south where this, you know, this is a discussion that people have put on the table, the question of climate refugees. So we don't have to do anything. It's already there. The question is, what do we do to maybe move it along or sharpen the debate and discussion. I think that's very, very important. The role we can play as a left in sharpening, in advancing the discussion, in getting into spaces and having the conversation about climate refugees. I think that's important, keeping the phrase going, as it were. The sanctions refugee and IMF refugee, those are also interesting. The question of the IMF refugee is also on the table, and not only from countries like Nigeria and Ghana, which have seen large outmigration in recent years, but the International Organization of Migration, which produces the World Migration Report, they themselves recognize large number of migrants leave because their countries have faced structural adjustment. Again, it's a matter of amplifying the work they have been doing. None of us is novel in this. We have to join those conversations, debates, and so on, try to strengthen them. If there are mass forces that you're involved with, to use this information within those mass forces to give clarity, maybe even give some strength to the International Organization of Migration, the people having the debate about climate refugees and so on. Sanctions refugee is a term I just made up for our presentation. But it's a real thing. It's a real problem. The 6.1 million Venezuelans are sanctions refugees. Do we want to start talking about this? Should, for instance, should the Group of Friends in Defense of the UN Charter, which is basically a group of 20 countries that have been sanctioned by the United States, including China, Russia, Venezuela, Cuba, Angola, Zimbabwe, etc., should they take up this question? In fact, maybe it would be a good idea to approach them, to approach ALBA TCP, the trading bloc of the ALBA movement, which includes, again, Nicaragua, Venezuela, Cuba, Bolivia, and so on, and say, hey, listen, maybe we should start talking about sanctions refugees, that these people, 6.1 million Venezuelans, are sanctions refugees. This transforms the debate. These people haven't been thrown out of the country by Nicolas Maduro or dictatorship or whatever. These people are fleeing because of the sanctions policy. So, what can we do? I mean, our ranks are not large. The left internationally is weak, but we don't have to start these. We're not carrying all the weight of it. We have to amplify, join, deepen, and so on, debates and discussions that are in fact ongoing.
Okay, we have.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Good. Very interesting discussion and very informative for me, particularly on sanctions and the cause and effect of immigration coming from Venezuela. Just a couple of things.
Not here.
Can you hear me okay? In the developed countries, like the United States, the European countries, Japan, we're looking at negative birth rates. And without immigration, these countries simply won't grow, including China. China also has a screwed up demographic, particularly going back to the one-child policy. That's just an aberration. A couple of observations. Where I live part-time in the United States in Florida, what I see are a lot of immigrants coming from Haiti. And the Haitian government it's a chaotic, almost criminal, what's happening. And these people are just getting out for their own safety, for the sake of their life and their sanity. Number two, where I used to live, we see people coming, which is in New England, we see people coming from Venezuela that are displaced and homeless, but we also see a homeless population in the United States, people living on the street. And when the local governments try to accommodate with housing, what you're running into are issues that we're trying to accommodate the homeless Americans that are living on the street, and we're just overwhelmed with the immigrants coming in from Venezuela. So it's just an observation to see the consequence of this type of thing. And the other observation I have is how screwy these policies are. Because, for example, in Silicon Valley, particularly when it was beginning to boom, many of these people came from countries like India, for example. And these people wanted to stay in the United States, and yet the screwy policy was your visa is up, go back home. And it just made absolutely no sense. So basically, developed countries won't grow without immigration. Number two, the consequence of sanctions, very, very interesting observation by you. So thank you very much for that.
I mean, firstly, I want to just say that the United States has the most bizarre immigration policy, if you can even call it a policy. I mean, there's something in US immigrant law called the T visa, T for tobacco. This is a visa for victims of trafficking. Yeah. So let's say I've been, gang raped somewhere and I flee and I come to the US border somehow, miraculously. And I have evidence that I've been trafficked or I've been, I'm a young minor in a brothel and so on. The average time to clear a T visa for the in the United States is 17 months. So somebody who has been trafficked with evidence, this is not a question of them looking into the evidence. On day one, the officer stamps the form and says sufficient evidence for trafficking, sent for processing. 17 months. If you read the Rand Corporation, that Project 2050 document, they actually want to tighten all these visas, including for human trafficking. I mean, forget IMF or sanctions refugees. I mean, these are the most clear-cut cases for asylum. The most clear-cut case is somebody who's been trafficked. They have to sit in effectively a prison for 17 months while their visa is processed. I mean, that is, for me, I find that insane. There's also another category U visa. If I'm a person in the United States, I've come, whatever, trafficked, and somebody does a crime against me, I'm able to get a U visa. I mean, U visa rates are also insane. I mean, they take months on end. It can take up to 5 years to get a U visa. Meanwhile, you have to sit again and wait. You mentioned high skills. This is people who come either on the H-1 or the H-2B visas. But graduate students today, not 30 years ago, today in the United States, graduate students in artificial intelligence related subjects, 2/3 of them are foreign born. So 2/3 of the graduate students in areas of artificial intelligence, the next phase of industrial development, are foreign born. They are not going to get visas to stay in the United States, not all of them. So they are going to go home. I mean, people say, well, the Chinese stole US technology. Not at all. Colleges like, Stanford and so on welcome grad students from China, high quality students, mathematics skills very high and so on. But the government wouldn't give them a visa to stay. So they go home. And anyway, anti-Chinese racism is picked up in the US. Why would they like to live in the Bay Area, even most liberal area, if they're going to be humiliated on the BART train or whatever? They've gone back to China. They live very well there and so on. So you're absolutely right. This is not a logical issue. the question of even declining birth rate, instead of addressing this in a rational way, you have J.D. Vance, maybe he'll be the next vice president, who's been saying that women are vessels to produce children and American women need to start producing more children. I mean, this is what, is becoming mainstreamed into US discourse, is that, US women need to produce more children. I mean, and the funny thing is, J.D. Vance's own wife is a migrant. She herself is from India, but that doesn't stop anything. They still make the case that the reason they are anti-abortion is that abortion is reducing the birth rate. And as the birth rate reduces, immigration is necessary, which is going to destroy the white Aryan nature of US society. So to preserve the white Aryan nature of US society, you have to have women not have the right to choose, have more children, therefore no immigration, and so on and so forth. I mean, it is an insane debate. It truly is an insane debate. What can I say? But there's the logic. It's punitive and insane.
Very interesting. And I can say that I'm 82 years old, but when I was, let's say, 30 years old, many people that would come into the United States, for example, from Mexico, when Mexico used to be a much poorer country, they would come in with visas. They had temporary visas, and they would go up, they would work in the fields, and then they would make some money. Then they would come back home with more money in their pockets, and then they could put a second floor on their home, if they had a home. But that seems to be all over now. They don't seem to give these temporary visas anymore. I could be wrong on that, but that seemed to work very well going back into the 50s and the early 60s in the United States. So, that's missing. And I also can't imagine even under the existing treaties that we do have for asylum, many of those treaties, I believe, came immediately after World War II. I could be wrong on that, but I think our asylum treaties go back to post-World War II, back into the late 40s or early 50s. And the qualifications for that were set forth in the treaties. Basically, those treaties obviously should be updated, but I'm thinking that even under those old standards, why can't they have a person, for example, living in a country that feels that they're entitled to asylum? Why can't they just apply online to come in and have that type of decision made that they're living in a dangerous part of the world where they're discriminated against, and alleging grounds under the old treaties that we have looking for asylum? That would seem to be a very efficient way to bring people in. If it could be worked out that way. Basically, people are forced to go through the Darien Gap and go up through Mexico and go to the border and try to get in that way. It would seem to me it would be easier if it could be done through online applications.
Again, this comes to a certain class reality. Certain countries, like Chile, for instance, where I live, Chileans can avail of the ESTA visa into the United States. That means that they can go online today and they can apply for a visa, which they get online, and then they fly into the United States. And if you've ever flown in the US, you'll hear somebody yelling at the immigration, all ESTA visas go there. All, students go there, whatever. There are visas, but they are only for certain countries. They are, for instance, for OECD countries. Chile is an OECD country. South Korea is an OECD country, and so on. Also, these applications aren't easy. You need a lot, you need to show a lot there. Many people who migrate, particularly economic refugees and so on, don't have the wherewithal to go online and apply for application. But there's also a kind of global division of humanity. Certain migrants from certain country, Haiti was an early example, are not going to be permitted to apply online. I mean, they, in a way, I'm sorry to use this language, but they almost need to be humiliated at the US-Mexico border. There's such a visceral historic hatred of Haiti, going back to the revolution of 1804, that Haitians are treated so poorly, sent to Guantanamo long before it became a war on terror camp. It was a camp for Haitians and then for people with HIV/AIDS. Haitians are brutally treated. There is an international division of humanity. You're never going to see, until you overcome that, a online process for anybody. It's certain countries do have online, but it's extremely narrow. Those temporary visas exist. Those kind of Gastarbeiter H4, I think, or something, agricultural visas exist. But here's the problem, is that in the older period, you would migrate, you'd work, let's say, on the fields, you'd earn it's not a great wage. You'll remember that Woody Guthrie song about the plane crash in Los Gatos Canyon, where the migrants were, going, they were on a plane, okay? They were not walking on foot. They earned some money. It was not great. They were hugely exploited, hence Cesar Chavez and so on. But they earned some money. And also, they could return to Mexico and they could start a business. The Mexican economy has been so badly damaged. It's now improving in leaps and bounds under the current administration. But it has been badly damaged. If you migrated to the United States, firstly, you're not able to save the kind of money that you used to. Things are so expensive in the US. You have to buy insurance of various kinds. You have to buy things for your children that you may not have under better social wage contracts and so on. And then if you have saved up enough, why would you go back to Mexico? What has happened to a kind of global imagination is the returning migrant is also seen as the failure. It used to be a time migrants would go out of Lebanon and they would work in West Africa and so on in business, or they'd go to the Americas. And then they would, meanwhile, send money home to build houses. And if you go up in the hills of Lebanon, in Dur Shwer and that kind of area, you'll see all these sort of houses built by migrants, a kind of vulgarity of size, because they wanted to prove, I went abroad. And then they would return and they would live like little kings with their wealth that they accumulated overseas. But increasingly, you're not seeing Lebanese migrants go back because they say, well, what am I going to go back to? There's constant problems in Lebanon, war, the country has been destroyed, no electricity, and so on. I mean, if you are an IMF migrant, you are not fleeing just to make money, you're fleeing to survive. You can't survive in a middle class, lower middle class life in your society. And those are the migrants. The migrants aren't, necessarily all farm workers. Even people who migrate, West Indian migrants who come on the agricultural visas, they are often lower middle class people who come to get income to improve their lives at home or to make a new life. They are not the same agricultural field labor crossing the border, what used to pejoratively be called wetbacks and so on. This is not the migrant. The migrant that comes to the US-Mexico border is often a low middle class person, used to have a shop, used to have some land on which they grew corn. I mean, El Chapo Guzman, the notorious narco boss, his father owned a small farm where he grew maize. And after NAFTA, the maize crop died off. He couldn't manage the farm. They tried to grow marijuana. And hence, El Chapo Guzman becomes one of the great drug barons of Mexico. I mean, he doesn't come from a drug family. He comes from a maize growing family, then moves to marijuana and eventually he corners the market in all kinds of things. So, I mean, the migrants themselves are not the same as they used to be. People who came to earn a little money to build a shop in their village. There's no main street in their village any longer.
Okay, I see we have a hand raised in line with Norma. Norma, you want to unmute yourself?
Ooh, and the street cleaner's just coming by. I can't hear anything. The discussion, hello Vijay, as I've said in my notes and my chat, I am a great supporter of your work. From several years now when I heard you at a presentation and you said all the things I want to hear. I'm a deep communist. I'm third generation and I'm a devotee. And I include Earth in the things we want to take care of, Earth with a capital E. You know, they don't capitalize the word Earth. They capitalize Saturn and Jupiter and all that, but they don't capitalize Earth. So it's begun to change. The things that you're saying, yes, we need to mitigate the horrors that have been imposed upon us in the capitalist world, which runs everything now. The Imperium, as I've commented, has been on the march against communism ever since 1917 and before. It frightens our owners. They're scared to death they will have their profiteering wrenched from their ownership. So they have all these wonderful wars that keep them busy and keep them making profit. But our thinking now is bound by, I mean, we're from the cradle, we're conditioned to hate and fear communism. And we constantly have been put in the position of having to try to come out from the constant assault that we can't take care of ourselves. You know, people are being shoved around like so many objects. Go here to do this, go here to do that. And the little children have to go line up to go to school, to be marched through the school, to be conditioned to fit into this system that their parents don't like. The idea that we cannot express our hatred, deep opposition to the control that is put upon us to try to be able to come out of our role in life of making profit for our owners. We can't be bound by that thinking in order to escape it. There was a show, you know, the Ken Burns programs in America, at least in public TV, and there was a show on the buffalo, and one of the things they said was that the buffalo, ousting the buffalo, killing off the buffalo meant, of course, ousting the native people from their homes into these horrible, degraded, insulting positions. And in the meantime, no buffalo meant that the wildlands disappeared. And so the wildlands became the farm fields that they grow crappy food on to feed the immigrants that they forced to emigrate to become the labor that it makes profit for our owners. So the nice call has been, for about 10 years, I've heard the phrase, bring back the buffalo, bring back the eagle. And I want us all to be thinking of the escape that we owe ourselves from this control. Capitalism doesn't permit people to work together, to have enough jobs for one. Jobs being the name of the relation of labor to capital. to be able to provide for care of us all. We're not allowed to do that. And of course, that's why Cuba is so assaulted. Cuba is so attacked, is because they're trying to do that. They have a totally different mindset. The people think altogether differently, and you can see it when people go and visit, and they cannot have a communication between themselves and the people there, because the Americans don't understand the Cubans or the Russians. The Russians also got conditioned to think another way. And I'm saying the idea of coming loose of the impositions of the way life is now, that we have to do something to make it a little bit gentler. And then we have to think of ourselves, revolutionizing ourselves to where we take control of our relation to being here. Probably a lot of it is a matter of reducing the population of the earth. As far as I can tell, has no ability to take care of this many people, etc.
I mean, I'm always happy to be in the company of a multi-generational communist. That's itself a great honor. You know, you're multi-generational. Norma probably takes you back to the Bolshevik Revolution. So
Well,
that's a treat.
My people
You
left.
know, I was trained by a person in India who went back one generation back to the founding of the Indian Communist Party in 1920, meaning he was trained by somebody who was one of the people who helped found the party. It's an incredible feeling of tradition, which is very important for all humans, you know, lineages, traditions, where we come from. Of course, equally important what you're saying, where we're going, you know, where we have to go. I think,
At least in our minds.
well,
minds. Yeah.
also in our practices
Right,
and in the
absolutely.
way we shape things, you know. It's interesting because, you know, people always say that quote from Rosa Luxemburg, socialism or barbarism. You know, if you go back and reread, if you go back and reread the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels, well, mainly Marx, writes in that either we advance to socialism or we'll have and this phrase is there in the English translation, the common ruin of contending classes. That's what they thunder in the manifesto. Either socialism or the common ruin of the contending classes, which is another way to talk about, you know, humanity divided by the class struggle. Either we advance to a better world of our own, you know, understanding and making, or we are all going to end it. I mean, pull the plug on the grenade, the earth being the grenade, and the whole thing explodes. I'm generally not a annihilationist or a, you know, extinctionist. I've, you know, like some of you, I've known Noam Chomsky for 40 odd years. This is the big argument we've been having over the years is, you know, he very much believes that if things don't change, we'll all end up being destroyed, you know. And I have a slightly different opinion. I think humans are crazy people. Think about the terrible things we've done in the past. I generally don't think annihilationist, extinctionist thinking helps motivate people to make the world a better place. You know, there are lots of people who put the disco music on when there's fires around them. They just don't care about that. People need a compelling reason to want to change the world, and the end of humanity doesn't seem to be compelling enough, okay? Otherwise, you know, climate change would be sorted out. I think people need a different story, which is actually we can live better as people. We can be kinder to one another. We can live in a world where we don't need gated communities and so on. You know, there's a better way to organize this. That's it, you know. We may or may not go extinct, but
Vijay,
that's another issue. But certainly the common ruin is real.
Vijay, you heard that in communist Russia, Soviet Union, there was virtually no crime. You heard that.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
And
But you-
probably the same is true in Cuba and all the communists going there. They're different. They are a different people. My favorite little story is they showed the children all lined up, the kindergartners lined up, buttoning each other's jackets in the back because the jackets were made with the buttons in the back. So if you, it's the whole intention. I mean, China is that different that we barely have any communication when we exchange together, the capitalists versus the communists.
Well, I'm going to have to leave in a little bit, but I would like to say that I spend, and this is going to be a highly controversial thing, and I wonder if the New York Times is listening in, but I do travel to China pretty regularly. I was there just a month ago, and I'll say to you that, you know, I have lots of friends and colleagues in Shanghai and so on, big cities. There is no crime. I've walked in the middle of the night and you know, one reason is that there really is no cash in the Chinese economy anymore. It's almost an entirely cashless economy. Everybody pays with Alipay or WeChat Pay or something like that. And as a consequence, you're paying with your phone. And because everybody seems to have a phone, because they've made very high quality phones pretty inexpensive, you don't need to steal phones. Phones are not the thing you want to steal. So that street theft doesn't exist. Now, there might be other kinds of theft. There's corporate theft. Chinese take that very seriously. Every year they seem to, you know, execute large numbers of corporate criminals and government officials, even party members. They execute them. You know, the death penalty is used against white-collar criminals. And they've been able to get rid of the normal street crime. You know, the death rate, the murder rate is extremely low. Now, I'm saying it's a controversial opinion because, you know, even among the left in the Western countries, there is such a negative attitude to China, a lot of it built from zero experience of the real country called China. I mean, you know, I once took a couple of journalists in China and said, let's go in search of homeless encampments in Shanghai, which is a city larger than most US cities. Couldn't find it. Asked the officials, where are the homeless people? They said, what homeless people? Well, have you picked them up in police vans in the middle of the night and dumped them at the city limits? They said, well, yes, it's true. When we do see homeless people, we pick them up. Where do you take them? Well, they've built apartments for them, you know, in and around the city. So yes, they do dump them at the city limits, but not on the street.
I have to tell you another thing. Fidel one time said, last night, 500,000 children slept in the streets. None of them is Cuban.
Correct. That's exactly correct. Well, Liz, I'm going to have to leave you. It's 4:30. In 2 minutes, I have to do something else. But it's been a pleasure. And when are you going to invite me to come to Mexico?
Oh, you have an open invitation, Vijay.
That's what they all say.
That's,
That's
you know,
Yeah.
no, it's been wonderful. And thank you so very much.
Thanks a lot, my friend. Great to see you. And Norma, take care of yourself. I see young people behind you. Make sure they get you a good cup of tea.
Oh, yes. Okay.
Bye, friends. Take care.